A while ago, I had a great talk with Victor Savkin about Angular and his book Angular 2 Router, the complete authoritative reference. I'd just like to mention, before the podcast starts, that since our interview, Victor has left his post at Google to become a co-founder of Narwhal Technologies, where he and his co-founder Jeff Cross will work more closely with enterprise teams working on Angular 2 applications. Narwhal is spelled NRWL for short, and you can find more information at nrwl.io, where they mention that the Narwhal team will remain active contributors on the Angular core team and will remain strategic partners with the Angular team at Google. Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this LeanPub podcast, I'll be interviewing Victor Savkin. Victor works at Google and is an Angular core team member and the main contributor to the Angular router. He also has interest in functional programming and client-side applications. When he's not working on Angular, Victor enjoys playing around with eclectic programming tech, and he has a particular interest in fonts and keyboard layouts. Victor is the author of the LeanPub book, Angular 2 Router, the complete authoritative reference. In his own words, the book goes far beyond a how-to-get-started guide and talks about the library in depth. The mental model, design constraints, and the subtleties of the API. Everything is covered. In this interview, we're going to talk about Victor's professional interests, Angular, his book, and his experience writing and publishing. You can read Victor's blog at vsavkin.com and follow him on Twitter at Victor Savkin. So thank you, Victor, for being on the LeanPub podcast.
Thank you, Len. Thank you for having me.
As you may know from listening to a couple of our podcasts, I usually like to start interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could tell us how you first became interested in doing the kind of work you're doing now and how you came to work for Google on Angular.
Sure. So originally I'm from Russia, from a city called Vladivostok. So I went to college there and I studied math there. So as a teenager, I was really interested into two things, programming and productivity. So I was playing with computers, like doing games and small apps as everyone does. When I was a teen, I guess around 15, so right before I went to college. At the same time, I was reading a lot about productivity, lots of books, articles, podcasts. And the reason why I was really interested into this topic of productivity is that I grew up in a small village near Vladivostok, and I went to a very mediocre school. So I thought if I apply myself and, if I manage my time well, manage myself well, I will be able to perform well, with kids from better schools, from excellent schools. So in a year, I wrote my first professional app, which was a productivity tool, like the most convoluted and over-designed to-do list you can ever imagine. It didn't sell really well, so it wasn't very successful. Then I had my own startup, which failed super quickly. I went through a bunch of companies working as a programmer, doing lots of different things, like backend, front-end, middleware. Then I moved from Vladivostok to Toronto, Canada. And after a few years, I got this opportunity to work on Angular, to join the Angular team at Google. And Angular is an extremely successful open source project. I think over 1 million of developers right now are actively using it. And it's a framework developers can use to build rich apps in JavaScript. So this opportunity was really exciting to me because I knew that I can sort of get back to what I liked as a teenager, which is making people more productive. But here, instead of helping them manage their time efficiently, I can help them building their apps more efficiently. So I jumped on this opportunity and moved to San Francisco, where I right now currently live and work on Angular. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Please continue.
That's basically what I'm doing right now. So I'm trying to make devs more productive, trying to make their lives easier, less painful, and I do that by making Angular.
And I've looked into this space a little bit myself, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what your to-do list, what your app was all about.
Oh, the first one. Oh boy. So I actually like this space a lot. And the first app, I think I had a few core ideas. The first one is instead of having a single, just a regular list, had different views to look at the list, so you can have different perspectives per se. Yes? One would be like a tree-like structure where you can organize complex projects and complex ideas, like link connections between them. Then you can project that complex tree-like structure into a bunch of flat lists. So you can actually execute it and sort of check it off, one by one. I also had an idea of so-called eating frogs, doing unpleasant things. So you can, in the app, you could mark certain things as unpleasant. So the app will force you to do unpleasant things first, in the morning. So you can, the rest of your day is not as, painful as the first 1 or 2 hours when you did all the unpleasant things. Sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really fascinating aspect of productivity. I was interviewing someone recently named Janelle Klein, who part of her approach is measuring pain. And one of the things she does in her analysis of it is to have developers describe, like, they just click one of three buttons, about the type of work that they're doing. And yeah, she's done a lot of really interesting work on that aspect of how to analyze productivity and sort of maybe change people's work practices.
Yep. So it's actually one of my main interests even at the moment. So I measure my productivity from morning till night, and I schedule my work based on where during the day it fits. For example, the first couple of hours in the morning, I find I'm the most productive. After I woke up, have a cup of coffee, usually like 4 or 5 shots of coffee, For 3 hours, I'm like a machine. I can do a lot of coding. I can think through complex problems. And then the productivity goes down, and I do more like mundane, simple, routine tasks, It's interesting if you like organize your work in this way, how much more you can accomplish having the same amount of time.
And what was your first startup, the one you mentioned briefly?
Okay, the startup was, so I was a teenager, like a lonely guy, a little bit nerdy. I was lonely. So it was a startup for lonely people who want to talk to each other. It was called Let's Talk. Basically, the idea was that you go on a startup, you go to on a page and you type in something like, I want to talk about this. Like, let's say I read Hemingway. I want to talk about this book a lot to someone who is around my age, someone I can relate to, And the app would match you with someone who is, has this interest at the moment, Either is active like online right now or was recently active with this interest. So hopefully you can connect within a day and you can sort of connect with the person and discuss the subject you deeply care about. It failed mostly because Russia is just crazy and super hard to get money, And I was very young too, so I didn't play my cards right,
I was going to ask. I know you're in the United States now, and you were in Canada for a while before that. But what's the culture like around startups in Russia? Is it something that is part of the popular awareness, or is it niche, or is it something that's growing?
I think it's very niche even at the moment. A few companies appear and disappear from time to time, but at no point you can get money as easily as you can get here. I think here, if you have a good idea and have a bunch of engineers who are like talented, most likely you can get some amount of money to work, let's say, for half a year. There it's almost impossible. You need to have friends or very personal connections, with someone who has money. And I think it's a little bit frowned upon. In general, Russians don't take risks as much as, let's say, Americans or Canadians. So it's not part of the culture. Russians value safety a little bit more, and as a result, startups are not as not as common, I guess.
And is there I guess what you might call it a STEM culture for people who are sort of thinking about what to do for, say, university studies in Russia? Is there a culture of sort of like approving of people who move into science, technology, medicine, and things like that, as opposed to other types of? I know it's a very broad generalization that I'm asking you to make, but is there, for example, if you're interested in computers, is there a cultural pull towards certain types of things rather than other things, especially given there isn't maybe so much of a startup culture there?
I don't think in general the IT culture or engineering culture is as dominant in Russia as it's here, especially in California. So there are obviously a lot of programmers who are talented and successful there too. But I don't think, at least I didn't feel I was part of the engineering culture, at any point. I was just a programmer who managed to do some programming, had a company I worked for, like a bunch of companies actually. But at no point I felt as connected to my peers in a broader sense, as I do, for example, here or I felt in Canada.
And how did you make your way to Canada? Why Canada?
In general, Canada has a very straightforward immigration system. That's part of it, so you can fill in a form. There is no lottery, once you get enough points, you have good education and good experience, you sort of, very likely to get a PR card, which is basically like a green card, yes, in Canada. And I like Canada a lot. I'm a lot more left-wing, in terms of my political views. So I think the way Canada functions and runs as a country is a lot closer to me than, for example, the States, So I still Canada is still my favorite country, I just happen to be in California.
And I have to ask, how was your first Canadian winter? Was it totally familiar?
It was basically the same as the Russian winter. So, yeah. I wasn't surprised at all. It actually felt good, that, hey, it's about the same, It's super cold. Your phone doesn't work outside because it's that, super cold. So, I don't know. I think there is an element of, I'm against the nature. It's so cold, the wind, the snow. For a couple of days, it actually feels really good. Then you get tired of it, you know.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. And so you eventually made your way to the West Coast. Did you apply to Google, or did they approach you?
Google approached me, so I joined Google because they approached me.
Okay. And just very generally, what's it like working at Google? I'm sure there are people listening who've worked there themselves, and
Yep.
people who would have thought about it and would like to.
Yep. I really like Google as an employer. I think it's a great company to work at. It's very comfortable. A lot of day-to-day stuff I had to take care of before, prior to joining Google. I don't have to worry about at Google at all. It's taken care of by someone else, you know. So I can focus on engineering and, you know, chatting with my coworkers and friends and whatnot. So I think it's a great company if you want to do engineering and you don't want to bother with, like, you know, you want to delegate all this extra stuff to someone else, you know. I think Google is a good place. There are a lot of interesting projects. You know, food is free or whatnot, but, you know, I don't think the food is free is the main thing. It's just an example of when something is taken care of, so you don't need to worry about it. So you can only worry about your project.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic environment. I mean,
Yep.
for an employer to deliberately take away that stuff for the sort of psychological reasons
Yep, exactly.
is a really interesting move, and I think something that's often misinterpreted, especially by perhaps grumpy people from
Yep.
generations who didn't enjoy what they see
Yep.
as perks,
Yep.
but sometimes can't see as the sort of hardcore productivity moves that they are.
Yep. I think it actually affected productivity a lot. Even though sometimes I miss going to like restaurants. Previously, when I lived in Toronto, we would go to a restaurant for lunch or like a fancy coffee shop, and here, like, well, it's still cool, but sometimes not exactly the same, you know? Slightly less hipster.
Yeah, that's good. Um, so on the subject of Angular, for those, let's imagine not everyone who listens to this podcast is in tech. If
Yep.
you were to explain to someone what Angular is, could you give it the 2-minute or 5-minute description?
Sure. I would say Angular is a set of tools and libraries you can use to build a client-side application, like, let's say, Gmail or Inbox, like this kind of application, a rich application with a lot of interactivity. So you can build it using Angular fairly efficiently. Like, I think it's probably one of the best tools if you want to get started and build something quickly, like within a few weeks. You can use Angular, and if you have some programming experience, most likely you'll succeed at building something that actually works. It gives you the sense of, I do it right now in a day, something actually runs and I can click around in the application functions, which is a very rewarding experience, especially for a lot of developers who are new to the industry, you know. They just started and, you know, they want to feel this immediate feedback of that. I tried it and it works, you know, so Angular provides that. So I think with Angular 2, the newest implementation of the framework, we try to keep that feel of like it just works, but adapt it so it works for larger projects and larger teams. You know, because Angular 1 was known to work excellent for smaller projects, but sort of, you know, miss a few things here and there when your project grows, you know, above, let's say, 50,000 lines, 100,000 lines, and you have like 20 developers working on it at the same time. Suddenly, there are a few things that weren't designed sort of exactly right for that situation. And I think Angular 2 solves this problem a lot better.
Yeah, you write about something called dead code elimination, which I gather is to help efficiency. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what dead code elimination is. So
the idea is that if you are consuming a lot of JavaScript libraries, let's say you consume Angular itself and a lot of other components from different libraries, if you don't use dead code elimination, what will happen is you have to ship all this code to the client, to the browser, for the application to run, to bootstrap. And it can be a lot of code. So if you're on mobile and you have like a not a very good connection, it may take a lot of time just to deliver the code, yes, and then to run it, actually to scan it, to parse it, you know, and whatnot. So that code elimination looks at your code and see which parts of your code cannot be reached in principle. So let's say it looks at a component or like at an ES6 module, which is a JavaScript module, and like this module is not used at all in your app. It happens to be a part of the same library, but we can statically deduce, you know, like analyze the code and statically decide that it's not used, so we can remove it from the production bundle. Yes, so we can drastically reduce the size of your application, so you can ship it quicker to the phone of your user.
And is this something that's happening continuously, or is it something that you do periodically?
I think it happens, like it depends on your sort of dev setup. So it happens before you ship to production, essentially. Yes.
Okay.
So during development, you can still do it. So for all sorts of reasons, maybe for performance analysis and whatnot. But before you ship to production, you run a special tool that will remove code that we know for sure is not going to be used, and will minify the rest of the code, optimize it and whatnot, So the deliverable is smaller, and we can ship it quicker to your customers.
Could you explain also a little bit about what the router is that you work on?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Thank you.
So router is the latest project I worked on. And I can talk a little bit about what routers do in general, because the word router is so generic, it may mean a lot of things. So I think that a big part of any application development right now is trying to manage state and manage state transitions. And doing this is actually very hard, especially on the web, because on the web, we want to ensure that the state of your application, at least a substantial part of it, is reflected in the URL. So you can copy and paste stuff, so the back button works and whatnot. If you want to provide a good web experience, the URL has to match the state of your application. This synchronization is non-trivial. Yes? In addition, we often want to split your application into multiple chunks that we call bundles, multiple bundles, so we can ship only the first bundle to your customer in Bootstrap, and then we can load lazily the rest of your application. Yes? So the Bootstrap time to the first interaction is a lot quicker. So doing all of this transparently is actually fairly hard, and that's what the router is doing. So using the router, you can declaratively specify the states in which your application can be. You can manage state transitions, and the router will take care of synchronizing your transitions with the URL, so the URL will always match. And the router will load other bundles on demand in a transparent way. So you as an application developer don't need to worry about it too much. It sort of happens, So while the user is navigating through your app, more and more code will be fetched from the server, and different parts of your application will be bootstrapped.
Yeah, and specifically you write about the concept of a route state. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that as well. Sure.
So a route state is it's somewhat nuanced. Application state can include a lot of things. Yes, you can, for example, have the state of your UI component. Something can be highlighted, something can be scrolled, or whatnot. Like a particular button can be in a particular state, and that's one part of the state. The other part is what's actually being shown. Yes, let's say if you go to an inbox or a mail app, what you can see is a particular message is being opened. Or if you open contacts, you are chatting with a particular person. What exactly you are typing in transiently, what you're typing, doesn't really matter, But what matters is what message is open, who you're chatting with, So that part of the state, persistent state, is what I refer to as the route state, because it's captured in the URL. Yes, it's part of what router deals with. You should be able to copy it, paste it, and send it to your friend. And if friends open it, the friend should see the same message being open and the same chat window or whatever, being open. Even though some details of where it's been scrolled to or whatnot, what was selected is not represented, that's good enough,
And Angular 2 has a particular focus on mobile, if I'm not mistaken. That I think I read somewhere, maybe it was on your blog, that you optimize for mobile first before, say, a web application or a native app. Is that, and that's correct? I was wondering if what the it's probably pretty straightforward, but what's the argument for designing something like this to be mobile first?
So I think that mobile puts a lot of constraints onto what you can do. Yes, the main constraint is, first of all, the main constraint is it's hard to fetch large resources from the server because your connection is usually spotty. Yes. So as a result, things like tree shaking matter a lot, or things like lazy loading, when you can ship only 20% of your app right away and it boots and you can interact with it on your phone already while we're getting more and more stuff from the server. Whereas on desktop right now, we have very powerful connections, you can ship megabytes, within half a second, So I think the size of your app after all the manipulation is done, the size of your first chunk of your app we need to ship is what makes a lot of stuff mobile friendly. And the second part which makes it mobile friendly is the ability to work when there is no connection at all. That's when you're on a subway or whatever, But the router doesn't deal with that. There's other parts of Angular and other parts of the infrastructure take care of that.
That's really interesting and really powerful argument. Was there pushback from the community when this mobile first focus was first launched?
I don't think so. I think most people realize at this point that most consumer apps or consumer websites have to work on your phone. And so it happens, it's much harder to make it work on your phone very well, you know? So the good experience on your phone is a lot harder to achieve. So if you can do that, you know, then making it work on desktop is usually fairly straightforward.
Okay, yeah, that reminds me about a story I heard about another company near you that would throttle like internet sort of speeds to its own employees to give them the experience of what it was like, you know, accessing from a network in a place with bad connections, and how that was meant to sort of really drive a focus on efficiency of how everything worked, and being sympathetic to that experience as well. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the future of Angular 2. Is there anything you can tell us that people can be expecting to see in the short term?
All right, so the future of Angular 2, so the first thing we are focused on right now at the moment is shipping final. So we're very close, and hopefully within a few weeks we'll be able to ship the final version of Angular 2. Fantastic. At which point we will sort of freeze the API. The API will be stable for at least half a year. We're going to, of course, make adjustments, fix bugs and whatnot, but you will be able to rely on the framework and build your apps knowing that nothing under you will change. Yes. So everything should be only better, yes, during this period. Like the framework should be faster. We are going to work on our compiler to make the deliverable smaller. We're going to improve the router, for example, to handle certain use cases we do not handle right now very well. But overall, it will be stable. It will be a good platform on which you can build your applications.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that answer. That's great. You mentioned in the introduction to your book that you're going to keep it up to date with future releases of Angular 2 and changes to the router. And I was wondering if this is the reason or one of the reasons you chose to publish your book on LeanPub in the first place.
Yep, it's a good question. So there are actually, I think, 3 reasons why I picked LeanPub over a traditional publisher. And that was one of them. One of them is that I can, because I work on open source, I got fond of the idea of publishing early and publishing often. So getting something out there which is 80-90% ready, almost ready, already can provide a lot of value to many people. And then you can get feedback from those people and improve it. It's a good way to make your product or your book a lot better. It probably won't work well for fiction, I don't know. But it works great for tech books, it's just perfect for tech books. So that's one reason why I chose LeanPub. The other reason is I read a lot of books that are published by LeanPub, and many of them had not narrow, but they were very focused, they were about one thing. So you buy a book and it's just about one topic, which you care about. Because often if you buy a book from a traditional publisher, not a half, but maybe 30% of the book is a filler, And I respect my readers' time a lot. I want them to spend the less amount of time they can reading my book, and extract everything they need, Because I know I'm not Hemingway, They're not reading it to enjoy the language, They need to extract value from my book. And if I publish via LeanPub, I can make the book as short as I want and just cover one subject, which is your router. I don't want to have some nonsense chapters about how to set up NPM or whatnot, You can find it online already in other places, Probably already know, That's why I picked LeanPub. Oh, and the last reason is that as a programmer, I'm very happy with the tech side of things on LeanPub. I have my own GitHub repo, which I push my updates to. My friends and my coworkers can comment on those. We don't need to send each other any documents, Basically, the best practices I'm accustomed to as a programmer, I can use while working on my book, which is version control, different tools, those kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's really a fantastic point about filler. One thing I think a lot of people who aren't so familiar with the publishing industry don't know is that a bookstore is basically a physical competition for space and for visual space in particular. And so one of the reasons books can sometimes be so fat is that they're squeezing out other books from the bookshelf, and they're displaying their spine or even their front if they pay for that privilege more prominently. And so books sort of literally get bigger because the book itself is an advertisement prior to its being purchased, and it's a sort of a weapon. against the other books. I wanted to ask you about the process of publishing in progress like that. How your book is currently marked to 95% complete, I think.
Yep.
I was wondering, what percent complete was it in your mind when you first published it?
I think it was about 80%. So I was planning to write, I guess, about 12 chapters, and I had about 10, and a few screenshots here and there were missing. And the examples were somewhat correct, but were not exactly right, So I would say you could still read it and learn almost everything about the router at that moment, So it was still, I could still provide a lot of value to many people. That's why I published it so early. But it wasn't done. And right now it's 95% because I'm finishing the last chapter. And I just want to make a few things here and there slightly better than to be 100% and to be fully complete. But after that, I can still improve it. I can still publish new versions, like adapt the book to the new versions of the framework or the router.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was wondering too how you incorporated feedback. So, for example, like you say you had actually people doing like commits on or comments on your GitHub repo.
Yep.
Did you invite people to do that, or did people
Yep.
just find it through your book? Or
so a few people, because I'm part of the Angular core team, a few people were very interested in making the router successful. So I asked them to look at my book, to look at my pull requests, and make sure that they are coherent, that I convey my information in a succinct and somewhat correct way. But a few people approached me from my readers and just, hey, I found a few issues, with your book, how can I give you feedback? And I just gave them access to my repo so they can comment about that,
Oh, okay, yeah, that's we've got a few authors who do that a lot. Also, somewhat surprisingly, given the power of GitHub, so a lot of people email works quite well as well.
Yeah,
and they can even start little conversations. I was wondering, I mentioned in the introduction, and from what I read about your self-description online, that you're into keyboards and fonts.
Yeah.
And as someone, we're in our own way picky about writing and tools and things like that. And I was wondering if there's anything that when you were using LeanPub, you would like to be picky about, and maybe give us a suggestion for a way we could improve it. We let you use your own tools, obviously, and we're sort of as broad as we can be on that level. But if there was something in our process that you think we could improve, or something new we could build, do you have any suggestions?
I'm thinking about it. It's hard to come up with a suggestion on the spot because I think the process was actually very good.
Okay.
It was fairly easy to get started. It took me maybe half an hour to set it up, super quick.
Okay.
It's hard to on the spot. I think it's actually pretty good already.
Okay.
Much better than I expected because I heard so many horrific stories about publishing, how hard it is. How much pain you have to go through, and it's probably the case with traditional publishers. I don't know. But my experience with LeanPub was very pleasant.
Yeah, it's not to disparage anyone, but there are just structural things about the conventional publishing process, which is still historically all sort of around print, and lots of timelines and people on a team who might not necessarily seem all that necessary to people. And I guess I'm going to say it in 2016, and there's lots of legacy in the process. But in particular, I think that people who are used to writing, who are technical and who are used to writing about technical things, they don't want to have to get in a fight to get a typo changed or updated. They just want to be able to make the change and get it out to people. Yeah, well, thanks very much. Oh, I wanted to ask you another question. So this is going back, so looping back around to the beginning of our discussion before we go. So as someone who's into productivity, what's your opinion of Slack?
I actually use Slack, and I think it is a good tool comparing to other tools in the market. I think Slack is a great tool. I use it a lot to chat with my teammates and to interact with people from different teams who use Angular. In general, I find asynchronous communication very hard to get right, so I think it's obviously useful, but it has to be a part of your team's culture more than any particular tool, And I think in our case, a huge part of our culture is actually being in the same room because most of Angular core and, 20 of us in the same room. So it's very hard to ignore that and always use Slack. Yes, when you can just turn around and chat with a person. So I think Slack can be more useful for other teams. I think it's useful for the Angular team, but may not be the most important tool for us.
The thing that I get preoccupied with when I think about Slack is the fact that it doesn't have replies yet.
Yep.
And so, there can be 3 conversations going on
Yep.
in the same sort of channel amongst many different people. And it seems to me to quickly degrade. And what people do in practice is they end up, whether it is just turning around or going to getting a meeting, or they end up having to diverge away from it anyway. But of course, it's so well designed and it's so easy to use that makes up for a lot of the sort of disintegrating conversation issue, which I'm sure they're probably thinking hard and taking their time to solve because they have it. Thanks very much, Victor, for doing this interview. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed hearing your story about Russia to San Francisco, Vladivostok to San Francisco via Toronto. And I wanted to say thank you for also being a Lean Pub author.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.